Welcome to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. The Real Story is produced by Breakthrough Ideas. To sign up for our newsletters, visit breakthrough-ideas.com. To listen to the podcast, visit Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or also you can visit breakthrough-ideas.com website and click on the latest podcast there. Today, we come to you with, great sadness following the July 4th massacre in Highland Park. Reading from the New York Post, they basically said that Highland Park Massacre marks the 309th mass shooting in the United States this year. They state the 4th of July bloodbath in Highland Park, Illinois, is where 6 people were slaughtered. Actually, that's been updated to 7 people were killed and dozens more injured. And I think the actual number is 47 injured when a gunman opened fire at the city's annual Independence Day parade on Monday. Aspiring rapper Bobby Cremo, 22, was identified as a person of interest in the massacre and taken into custody shortly following the carnage. According to them, this is the 309th mass shooting of 2022, according to Gun Violence Archive. It's a nonprofit that tracks shootings in which at least 4 people are wounded or killed, excluding the shooter. Let's see. What else do we have to tell you about this? In addition to the Highland Park slaughter, 5 other mass shootings broke out in the U.S. on July 4th, including incidents in Boston, Chicago, and Richmond, Virginia, according to the GVA, the Gun Violence Archive database. So not the only one on July 4th. And when they talk about Chicago, if you look at the website Hey Jackass, which tracks all sorts of Chicago crime, according to their website, for the 4th of July weekend, there were 12 murdered and 16 additional people wounded by gunfire. So we have a problem on our hands, and a lot of people are looking for solutions, as they always do following a mass murder. Well, here is an interesting article that showed up today by Matt Rosenberg. He writes with Wire Points, and he says the July 4th mass shooting at a parade in northern Chicago, a suburb of Highland Park, killed 70 and wounded 30, was deeply disturbing and tragic. We all agree with that. A suspect was taken into custody, he goes, there are 4 things crowding the viewfinder. He says the media and the public need to understand that the ongoing emphasis on mass shootings and gun control is a losing strategy. It's easier to strategize smartly if you have a clear view of the landscape. Here's 4 things to understand. Number 1, many people are using mass shootings for political ends as a justification for greater gun control. But the fact is that only 4% of homicides in Chicago so far this year, 3% last year, and 3% of national firearm deaths in 2020 occurred through mass shootings. Every shooting is tragic. We all agree with that already. We're just talking about mass shootings. 2022 is no different from prior years. Matt Rosenberg writes, the vast majority of homicides in Chicago and firearm deaths naturally do not occur due to mass shootings. According to the Chicago Sun-Times Homicides in Chicago database, this is important, 321 people have been killed in Chicago up to noon of July 5th of this year. And of course, for the July 4th holiday weekend, that was 12 killed and 68 wounded. Of those 321 people, 279 have been black, 17 white, 43 Latino, 1 Asian, and 1 of other. Meanwhile, the Gun Violence Archive tracks mass shootings in the United States, which it defines as any shooting where at least 4 people were wounded. I already talked to you about those statistics. Moving on. As a conclusion for this first point, therefore, just 4% of all Chicago homicides to date this year have resulted from mass shootings. Number 2, future gun control legislation is sharply limited by law, particularly by the latest in a string of U.S. Supreme Court decisions favoring gun rights. Legal firearms are here to stay, and robustly so. Sharp rises in urban violent crime make the politics of a renewed assault weapons ban all but impossible. In truth, gun control advocates can only nibble around the edges. That is true. Let me pause there for a moment and remind people that even if you favor more gun control and gun control laws, I think it's important to point out that if any place had an insufficient amount of gun control laws, it wasn't Highland Park. Here's why. Back in 2013, the Illinois state legislature was under the requirements to pass concealed carry legislation, as we were the last state in the United States to have any form of concealed carry legislation. In passing that legislation, one of the features of that legislation was to let me find you this. Sorry, as I go here. One of the features of the legislation was to allow for home-ruled municipalities to give them the authority to ban assault weapons, but they had to do it within 10 days of the bill being signed. Reading from a Chicago Tribune article. After an emotional meeting in which people lined the walls and overflowed, and this is from 2013. 2013 is when that concealed carry legislation came into place. After an emotional meeting in which people lined the walls and overflowed from the city council chamber, Highland Park officials voted this week to ban assault weapons in their community. Highland Park, 2013, banned assault weapons in their community. Gun enthusiasts said the ordinance would not stop crime, except by making criminals out of responsible rifle owners. Others applauded the move as helping to protect the city against tragedies. When state legislators recently approved a bill to allow Illinois owners to carry concealed handguns, in full disclosure, I was a member of the state legislature who had to vote on that legislation. They preempted municipal home rule authority for cities like Highland Park to ban assault weapons. So in that legislation authorizing concealed carry, we also said that if you're a municipality, you can't just blatantly just ban assault weapons in your community. But there was a caveat that allowed local laws to stand if already on the books or created within 10 days of the governor's signature. At that point, Pat Quinn had until July 9th to sign House Bill 183, otherwise known as the Firearm Concealed Carry Act. The state of Illinois, get a load of this, the state of Illinois failed us, said Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering. She is still the mayor that just experienced a tragic and horrible mass murder. Adding that, she adds that, our entire goal was to preserve home rule. When the council voted 6-1 on June 26 to create a ban on weapons modeled after Cook County's law. The ordinance gives owners of weapons or large-capacity magazines 90 days to remove the items from city limits, permanently modify them or not fall under the law's definition, or surrender them to police for disposal. Violation of the ordinance will be considered a misdemeanor that could include up to 6 months in jail or a fine between $500 and $1,000. David Knapziger was the sole councilman to vote against the ban, saying he had questions about the ordinance's effectiveness and legality. But there's no question in my mind about the specter of hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of litigation costs that the ordinance would generate, Knapziger said, echoing the comments of several firearms supporters who threatened legal action against the city. All right. So just to be clear here, first of all, gun control legislation, as Matt Rosenberg wrote, is sharply limited by law, but Highland Park had laws on the books banning assault weapons. All right. Moving on. Number 2 point that Matt Rosenberg makes in his article from Wire Points. 4 things you need to know about mass shootings in the new gun control landscape. Number 3, the relentless focus on gun violence obscures a core truth. It is usually disturbed young men at the trigger. People are killing people, and often gun laws are not remotely obeyed. Well, Highland Park's a perfect example of them not being obeyed. The way that parents raise young men at risk needs more attention. The solutions are more human and family-based than technocratic. And he goes on to explain a little bit. I'm going to read some from his article. The gun used by 21-year-old alleged Highland Park shooter Robert Bobby Cremo was legally purchased in Illinois. He had also purchased other guns. He has not yet been proved beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty of committing the killings. However, it seems fair to say that if your son is producing rap videos which depict a fantasy version of a classroom shooting and an insistent narration that this is his destiny, then he badly needs help. CNN summarizes here several of his disturbing videos, and he links to it. Other warning signs from the Highland Park suspect were apparently missed by police, state authorities, and his parents. In April 2019, Highland Park police spoke to the suspect and his parents after they were notified of a suicide attempt. Then in September 2019, police took 16 knives plus a sword and a dagger from Cremo at his home after his family reported he had said he was going to kill everyone. It gets deeper. Illinois has so-called red flag law, which permits the state to revoke an existing firearms owner's identification card for 6 months if a firearms restraining order had been issued to a gun-owning individual upon petition by a family member, roommate, or law enforcement officer. Under the law, the petitioner could seek to renew the order indefinitely every 6 months. In any case, no member of Cremo's family so petitioned the state. Further, in 2019, he would have been only 18 and could not have tried to buy a gun in Illinois without written consent from a family member. Nevertheless, the broader issue remains that warning signs were clearly evident, and yet local and state authorities somehow managed to get a clearly disturbed individual slip through the cracks to become a legal gun owner and then an alleged mass killer. This does not bode well for the hope that more regulation is the primary means to quell violence involving firearms. In effect, we have two main types of mass killings now in the United States. There are showy mass killings, often perpetrated by disturbed young white men, as evidenced by Buffalo, Uvalde, and now Highland Park. And there are sadly everyday urban mass shootings perpetrated in primarily black neighborhoods in cities of various sizes by young men all too ready to settle day-to-day disputes with violent force. He couldn't have been more right about that. Okay. Now, number 4, another thing to know about mass shootings by Matt Rosenberg. Number 4, the best way for the government to regulate what it calls gun violence is for local prosecutors and judges to deal more strictly with repeat gun law offenders and other convicted violent criminals. Barring that, get ready for a continuing surge in private gun ownership. Precisely right. And why is he precisely right? Well, because Matt Rosenberg also wrote a seminal piece not that long ago in Wire Points. You can go ahead and look it up. It was published on, let me see. I'm going to find it for you here. Yep, here it was published on June 30th, 2022. New 2021 Chicago data shows 400,000 high-priority incidents where dispatchers had no police available to send. So this is why you can get ready for more private gun ownership, because the police cannot even get to you in time of needs. So back to the Highland Park shooter and what's going on here, because it's very disturbing. It's very disturbing. And given all the other factors, in that Highland Park had an assault weapons ban, in that Illinois has a red flag law, and that the perpetrator, the alleged shooter, had multiple interactions with police and warning signs, and they were just completely abandoned. And given the fact that the police can't be there when you need them, you're going to get more people purchasing weapons. But why is it that this young man went this route? Well, I think Matt Rosenberg hits the nail on the head when he discusses that we need to look at the way parents raise young men at risk. That needs more attention. Listening to the radio program by Dennis Prager the other day, he also brings up a huge issue, as does Alex Berenson. This comes from an Alex Berenson post. I get his posts regularly in his email. And this was his email dated Tuesday, July 5th. Cannabis user of the day, Bobby Cremo III. This popped up on Reddit shortly after the police announced his name as a person of interest in the Highland Park parade mass shooting yesterday. It isn't the only reference to Cremo's cannabis use. Much of the online evidence about Cremo that has come out since last night, the pamphlet made up entirely of numbers and bizarre Twitter feed, screams untreated or uncontrolled psychosis. Expect his family to make halting statements about mental illness soon. And what are we talking about? Well, there was a number of there was posts basically indicating that he just seemed to be a typical stoner kind of guy at the time. These are people that knew him. He seemed to be a typical stoner guy at the time. Now, Alex Berenson has been all over this topic about cannabis use and psychosis and its effect on violence. And reading this one is from that same time frame, 6/30/2022. Alex Berenson writing in his Substack, today's extraordinary New York Times piece on cannabis and psychosis. And he writes, I cannot stop thinking about the sea change represented by the New York Times article today about mental health dangers of cannabis. In January 2019, Simon & Schuster published Tell Your Children, my book arguing cannabis use causes psychotic episodes and is likely a significant contributor to schizophrenia and thus to violence because untreated psychosis drives violence. 2 3-word sentences summarize the book's thesis. This is Berenson's book. Cannabis causes psychosis. Psychosis causes violence. This simple statement stirred a furious media response, not just to the second sentence, but to the first, and not just from the cannabis advocates, but from nearly the entire non-conservative media. The Washington Post published an op-ed calling the book The Return of Reefer Madness, and another that criticized it for promoting myths about marijuana, and still another that said it was ramping up the alarmism. Again, those 3 pieces ran the Washington Post, not openly left-leaning outlets like Rolling Stone or Vox. Reporters at these places engaged in a semi-coordinated campaign to smear the book and me, writes Berenson. And he goes on and on. The bottom line is Berenson spent his time writing an entire book about cannabis contributing to psychotic episodes in kids and therefore creating violence. Now, what's also interesting on that same topic is that Dennis Prager covered this in his podcast, in his discussion. I think it was yesterday's. Here's another one. This is from May 26, 2022. Could SSRI antidepressants be one of the causes behind these mass shootings? This is written by Darren Cummings. Oh, I'm sorry, it's by Bob Hoagie. Mass shootings in the United States have increased dramatically over the last few decades. Those trying to explain the phenomenon have blamed gun laws, social media, white nationalism, extremist politics, pandemic policies, and the list goes on. But what if there's another factor at work here? Guess what else has soared in the last few decades? The use of antidepressant medication, especially SSRIs. It was in 1987 that the first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, commonly known as an SSRI, was developed, and it quickly became the standard. You've probably heard its name, Prozac. He goes on and on about this. The drugs are fairly effective, depending on who you ask, in treating depression, and many users report remarkable improvements in their mental health. I know quite a few people who take them, and they describe the lifting of the dark cloud of depression and despair that has been dominating their lives. But there's another side to these drugs, one that must be taken into account. Read the potential side effects that the FDA requires to be printed on the label of every antidepressant. Anxiety, agitation, panic attacks, insomnia, irritability, hostility, aggressiveness, impulsivity, on and on. Mania. And the article goes on and on. Could these be behind mass shootings? Well, we don't know. We don't know enough about any of this information, but we need to know. And we need answers. And they shouldn't be political in nature. And they shouldn't be taking away your rights, your constitutional rights either. They should be about getting to the bottom of this. And I don't care who you talk to or what race they are, many of them will agree that we have a cultural and societal breakdown that is creating much of the problem that we find with our young, black or white, Latino, I don't care. You got mass shootings happening on the city of Chicago streets every weekend. You got mass shootings happening around the United States by, young white men. So what's going on here? It's not the guns. It's not the guns. And until you have politicians stop hyperventilating about gun laws that, by the way, again, Highland Park, every gun law under the book, red flag laws, you name it. And everything went awry. You have a disturbed young man whose family, I think personally, ignored the warning signs. And so now you have 7 dead and about 47 wounded. So it's time for real answers. And, just to add to a little bit of the drama here, Pritzker issues a disaster proclamation to help Highland Park recover from its mass shooting. Following a deadly mass shooting at Highland Park's 4th of July parade, Monday, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation for Lake County to assist in recovery efforts. The disaster proclamation, which remains in effect for 30 days, grants Illinois the ability to expedite the use of state resources, personnel, or equipment according to the release. Blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, he completely has ignored Chicago, trying to get resources there. Following, let's just look this up again. Let's see what are our statistics to date for Chicago. Here we go. Again, I'm at the website heyjackass.com. Yes, final tallies: 12 killed, 68 wounded. Let's see, what do we got? Year to date, 314 shot and killed, 1,374 shot and wounded. Total shot, 1,688. Total homicides, 343. There you go. That's what we got. Halfway through the year, that's your tally right now. And let's see, 2021 homicide total. Total homicides, 477. We're only halfway through the year. We have 314. And I didn't see Pritzker issue a disaster proclamation for the city of Chicago to help them recover from shootings, mass or otherwise. Nope, just completely ignored. Speaking of disaster proclamations, this is unrelated, but I think it's important to point out. J.B. Pritzker, again, on June 24th, issued his 31st consecutive 30-day disaster proclamation related to COVID. His 31st in a row. I think he's going to go for a record at least 3 years of continuous disaster proclamations by a governor who needs to be voted out of office in November, or otherwise you're going to be under complete tyranny. He's never, ever going to give it up. Never going to give it up. It's just, you just can't even make it up. So anyway, I think that everybody's looking for answers. We all want real answers. We don't want these. We don't need Kamala Harris to come in to Highland Park and make some speech where she just actually made no sense at all again. And JP, maybe we can pull that tape because that is amusing. So we'll try and insert that into this podcast as well. But, much more discussion on this going forward, and hopefully real answers this time instead of talking points from some political hack. All right, coming up next, I have Steve Goreham in studio with me to talk about the green energy scam and talk about the latest Supreme Court ruling that beat down the EPA by over-regulating the coal industry. You'll learn a lot when you listen to Steve, so keep on tuning in. Thank you. Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. In studio with me today is Steve Goreham. He is a friend of the show. You've heard him before on my podcast, and in his expertise is energy, everything energy. And we're going to talk about specifically the Supreme Court decision that put the brakes on the EPA in a far-reaching decision. That headline comes straight from the Wall Street Journal. The High Court says the agency, the EPA, overstepped its authority in restricting greenhouse gas emissions in a ruling with ramifications for other regulators. So Steve Goreham, just a little bit more about you so our audience understands that we're talking with a real expert here. He's a speaker, an author, and a researcher on energy, industry, and environmental issues, and an independent columnist. He's the executive director of the Climate Science Coalition of America and advisor to the Heartland Institute. He is the author of 3 books, including Outside the Green Box, Rethinking Sustainable Development. More than 100,000 copies of his book are now in print. Steve holds a BS and an MS in electrical engineering from our own University of Illinois and an MBA from the University of Chicago. He has more than 30 years of experience in Fortune 100 and private companies in engineering and executive roles. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jeanne. Great to join you again.
Yes. So we specifically were having you on in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, which essentially, can you explain a little bit more about that decision? It deals entirely with the EPA's role in shutting down coal. And of course, it was brought by West Virginia coal companies. Right. And it was a response to them over-regulating from a perspective of just the agency making decisions rather than legislators making decisions.
Yes.
So I'm interested in that aspect as we have a more regulatory environment overall, whether it's at the state, the local, or the federal level. You find it everywhere where they're letting just agencies make decisions. But could you also speak to the aspect specifically of what this means for coal going forward?
Right. So the EPA's power to regulate air emissions comes from the Clean Air Act of 1977, revised 1990, and then a little bit beyond that, where Congress gave EPA the power to limit emissions of, I think they listed about 50 or 60 items in that act. Carbon dioxide, by the way, was not one of those.
Wow.
And then in 2015, under the Obama administration, the EPA came out with a Clean Power Plan, which aimed to get utilities and states to reduce emissions from power plants by 32% by 2030. The Supreme Court actually stayed that effort at that regulation in 2016. And then when Trump came in, his EPA said that the EPA had overstepped their bounds. But I think West Virginia was afraid that EPA was going to come back and try and reinstitute something like that, which would have cost billions of dollars to the utilities. And it was what the Supreme Court was talking about was what they called a generation shifting effect. That was actually what EPA called it, generation shifting. And the court said that Congress did not grant EPA the authority to do generation shifting, and said it was going to cost billions of dollars. And so they said this is up to Congress to step in and clarify what they want to do, and that the EPA doesn't have the power to do this sort of generation shifting. And as a matter of fact, cap and trade, which they have in Europe for carbon dioxide emissions trading, has been defeated 5 times in the United States over the last 3 decades by the Congress. Either it wasn't brought because they didn't have the votes, or it was actually voted down. And so it's clear Congress doesn't want to go that far, but nevertheless the EPA has tried to do that with the Clean Power Plan, and the Obama administration, or the Biden administration was attempting to go do that again. At least that was West Virginia's fear.
Well, the Wall Street Journal wrote specifically about the decision. They pulled a quote from the Chief Justice wrote. And, of course, Chief Justice Roberts wrote this decision, which is phenomenal. And he wrote, "A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself or an agency acting pursuant to a clear delegation from that representative body. The vague language of a long extant but rarely used statute is what the EPA was doing in finding new powers." So they went way beyond what they were required to do as an agency. And when you talk about this, and I think it's funny because you kind of like glossed over this comment, but it's true. The EPA was set up and they were set to limit emissions on 50 different pollutants.
Right.
And then you just, as a off the cuff remark, said, one of those is not CO2.
Right.
But carbon dioxide is basically what this hysteria is all about.
Yeah, it is.
So can you talk more about that? Because this idea that limiting carbon dioxide is the holy grail when we've already been able to scrub off many of the other pollutants that are created from producing energy. What's going on here?
Right. Well, there's been an industry that has grown up that talks about limiting carbon dioxide, and actually a suit was brought in 2007, I believe, by Massachusetts and some other states versus the EPA. And the court then ruled, the Supreme Court, that the EPA had to make a decision. They had to either decide one way or the other on carbon dioxide. And so the Obama's EPA, on December 7, 2009, a date that will live in infamy, not in memory of Pearl Harbor, but on that date, the EPA ruled the so-called endangerment finding, that greenhouse gases were endangering the health and safety of U.S. citizens. And so that has really been the basis of things and eventually led to the Clean Power Plan. But now the new Supreme Court has say, well, wait a minute, you can't go as far as you're going. You have to go back to Congress to get specifics. There's also a doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine that the current court holds to. And it basically says if this question is major, you have to go back to Congress to get it done. And that's pretty much what they ruled. And it was interesting that it was a 6-3 ruling with Chief Justice Roberts joining the conservative group to turn this over. But as you know, there have been all kinds of statements now about how terrible this is. President Biden first said this decision risks damaging our nation's ability to keep our air clean and combat climate change. Senator Elizabeth Warren said the planet is on fire and this extremist Supreme Court has destroyed the federal government's ability to fight back. And then we have Representative Raul Grijalva, Democrat of Arizona. The Supreme Court had, quote, sentenced our planet to death. All these things, all these wild statements. This whole idea, though, that Biden says keep our air clean and combat climate change. There's always a conflict. There's a conflation, I should say, clean air and carbon dioxide, which is incorrect. We breathe in only a trace of CO2, only 4 molecules in every 10,000 in the atmospheric carbon dioxide, just a little bit. But every minute we're burning sugar in our body, and then so we exhale 100 times what's in the atmosphere with every breath. We all exhale carbon dioxide. It's not a pollutant. It doesn't harm anything. It's great for plants. Sometimes I put up a chart that shows the world's top 7 food crops all growing bigger with higher levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. If there's one compound we could put into the biosphere, that's great for the biosphere, carbon dioxide is that compound.
Well, and what's interesting, if you're growing marijuana in some sort of like greenhouse.
Yes, ma'am.
What are you pumping in? You're pumping in carbon dioxide to make those plants grow bigger and faster.
Yeah, I always ask that to audiences, and I love to put up images of they got a tank of CO2 right here, and they got something else over here.
Absolutely.
So it's really been kind of crazy, and it's because of this obsession of global warming, the greenhouse effect, and other things that people say we have to get rid of all carbon dioxide. The world is spending over $500 billion a year to try and do that, and it's really a shame. Every dollar that we spend on carbon capture and all these other foolish things is not money that could go toward getting clean water for people around the world, food, and bettering the standard of living of people around the world.
That's far more important to people's health is clean water, and yet we have 400,000 lead pipes in the state of Illinois that Lori Lightfoot has recently said will take 50 years to correct, and it's going to be, I think it's a $15 billion project. But I think clean water is far more important at this point than CO2, which is actually beneficial for plant growth. Not to mention, there's so much more we could talk about this. I love this one. This is Eric Milito, writing in Real Clear Energy. This is from June 26, 2022. Chasing Utopian Energy, How I Wasted 20 Years of My Life. And he basically admits, I wasted 20 years of my life chasing utopian energy. Utopian energy is an imagined form of energy that's abundant, reliable, inexpensive, and also clean, renewable, and life-sustaining. But utopian energy is as much a fantasy as utopian society. And, he goes on and on to basically admit, and I wish there were a lot more people who would admit, that they basically, bought into a lot of climate hysteria that just isn't actually essential. He goes, I used to think solar and wind power were the best ways to reduce CO2 emissions, but the biggest reduction in CO2 emissions during the last 15 years, over 60%, has come from switching from coal to natural gas.
Bingo. That's right on the nose.
And now, in the wake of an energy crisis, we actually should be working on more coal energy rather than shutting it down, which we're doing in the state of Illinois. And now you've got Ameren essentially saying, look, you have signaled to the coal that they're not welcome anymore. So guess what? They're not investing anymore in their plants. Yeah. And those plants need investment every single day. Maintenance needs to be done. And since you intend to shut them down and say we're not going to have any more fossil fuels by 2050, which is ridiculous, not doable, can't run a modern economy or even any semblance of it. Can't charge your cell phone, sorry, with the windmills that aren't blowing. So when the wind's not blowing. You're signaling to these people, so they've already decided to shut down coal by themselves because you told them they're not going to shut down. And Ameren puts out a warning: expect higher prices and rolling blackouts in central and southern Illinois.
We'll have to talk about some of that. A little history, though. The point about natural gas is very important. People don't remember, most of the young people, that people used to do spring cleaning every spring in the 1950s and 60s. My grandfather had a coal furnace, and he had a coal bin. A big truck used to come up and dump coal down into his coal bin in the basement. But people would do spring cleaning because and it would snow in Chicago, and in 5 days they would have coal dust, on all the snow. The snow would be black, and people did spring cleaning in the spring. They actually would wash walls to take the coal dust off walls. But natural gas has changed all of that. Natural gas came in, it made our air very, very much cleaner. And even today, there are still 70 million homes in Europe that are burning wood for fuel. If they replace those with natural gas, the particulate levels would go down by a factor of 1,000 in a home from burning gas and other things. By the way, coal, now we put scrubbers on plants, so we get rid of all that sort of stuff, and it's very much better. Our air pollutants are down 80% since 1980. But again, that's not counting carbon dioxide. We got to make sure that we don't get involved in that.
So I mean,
that
there's
misconception.
When you're talking about energy as a whole, I think that people they're confused to some degree. So we think about we should have electric vehicles instead of having oil-based automotives.
Yep.
But those electric vehicles are going to be powered by what in the future?
Whatever's in the electrical power supply, of course.
Right.
Today, that's still 60% of the world is hydrocarbons. In the U.S., the current numbers are, I think it's about 20% coal, 40% natural gas, 20% nuclear, and there's about 10 or 11% is wind and solar currently. So it's a pretty good mix of hydrocarbons still. We're running about 60% like the rest of the world. But the other thing about electric vehicles is they require a lot of hydrocarbons to produce. To produce those batteries requires a huge amount of emissions. When you first get an electric car, you've emitted a lot more carbon dioxide emissions for what it's worth. Again, shouldn't be a big deal than an internal combustion engine car, and it isn't until you've driven 100,000 miles that you may catch up. One of the problems with the wind industry right now is the price of steel has gone way up with this world energy crisis, and they put so much steel in their wind turbines, they can't make any money anymore with the price of steel.
And they produce that steel using hydrocarbons.
That's right. They use coke, and they use natural gas for heating, coal and natural gas. The steel industry, 1.6 billion tons of steel a year, and they use vast amounts of hydrocarbons. So we really can't get away from those. It would be decades and decades and decades. And again, when the world wakes up and realizes that carbon dioxide isn't such a big problem, maybe a lot of this will go away. We'll see.
Well, I think that's the crux of the problem. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? I mean, so this whole hysteria surrounding CO2 and rising seas that they say is occurring. I mean, these are things that in nature have occurred before.
Right.
Increasing temperatures have occurred. Higher temperatures have occurred before. You've
Right.
talked about this before, but just recap for the audience, because I think that's really important.
There's 4 bases for the theory of dangerous global warming. The first is the greenhouse effect. Sunlight enters our atmosphere. What isn't reflected by clouds is absorbed by the surface of the Earth. The Earth, like any warm body, gives off lower energy infrared radiation. Almost all of that, as it heads out to outer space, is trapped first by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. It causes molecules to radiate, and those gases then re-radiate that energy, and that does tend to warm the surface of the Earth. So there is a greenhouse effect. The second is rising atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, the second basis. Scientists first measured those levels in the 1950s. At that point, they measured about 315 parts per million. And today, they measure about 400 or 420 parts per million. So there's been a rise. Mm-hmm. And the proponents of the theory of man-made warming say that is due to our industries putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's enhancing the greenhouse effect, and it's causing dangerous warming. The third basis is rising global surface temperatures. But those temperatures haven't risen very much. I was on a phone call with a couple girl students from UCLA a while back, and telephone interview, I started asking them questions. I said, well, how much do you think temperatures have risen? Oh, 5 degrees. The answer is 1 degree Celsius in 140 years. About 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all global temperatures have risen. And as we've discussed before, there were at least 4 long periods in the last 10,000 years when it was naturally warmer than it is today. And that's when there were no emissions from our society. I mean, effectively zero. And then the fourth basis for the theory is computer model projections. Climate models are run on supercomputers, and they project a much faster rise. A rise of 3 degrees Celsius or 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. And then from all of those, from that temperature rise, we're supposed to be experiencing melting ice caps, rising oceans, flooding coastal cities, stronger hurricanes and storms, droughts and floods, species extinction, and all sorts of other things. And there's a new one every day if you read the press. But when you really look at it, there really is not any empirical evidence for the theory of man-made warming versus natural factors. Some things people don't know. The first is that our dominant greenhouse gas is not carbon dioxide. It's not water vapor. I always ask audiences this, and some of them now get it's not methane. Not carbon dioxide, not methane. The answer is water vapor is Earth's dominant greenhouse gas. Somewhere between 70 and 95% of Earth's greenhouse effect is caused by water vapor and clouds. And that's what's blamed on for dangerous global warming. So if we say, okay, 3/4 of the greenhouse effect is due to water vapor and clouds, then the last quarter is mostly caused by carbon dioxide. But then we got to say of that last quarter, how much is natural versus how much comes from our industry? Because we have carbon dioxide everywhere.
Absolutely. The
oceans have 50 times as much carbon dioxide as the atmosphere, and the oceans are always naturally releasing it and absorbing it. When plants die, they release CO2. When they grow, they absorb it. It turns out that every day, nature puts 20 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as all of our industries and removes about the same amount. So what we're doing is really we're trying to mess with this very, very small part of things, and we're spending billions and trillions of dollars to do it and trying to change our homes, our businesses, our travel, and everything else. And it's unlikely we're ever going to see an effect of all this, except the real economic effects to people and businesses and states.
Well, I mean, the economic effects have been devastating. So you look now at Europe, which is having to turn to coal in the wake of not receiving natural gas from Russia, in the wake of having shut down their nuclear power plants, and now having to actually provide for energy. They're starting to restart their coal plants that they had previously shut down, because it's still the concentrated power that they receive is well worth them not instead having industries and homes without heat and energy to make things.
I tend not to be alarmist, but more and more I'm thinking we're ready for a real disaster in Europe.
Tell me about that.
Well, a natural gas price, this is a Netherlands hub, has typically run about 15 to 20 euros per megawatt hour is how they measure it. That's what it ran in 2019, 2021, 15 to 20 euros per megawatt hour. Last year, the wind didn't blow in Germany and England and France, and so output from wind turbines, and they have all these wind turbines, was down about 40%. So they burned gas all summer. When they got to the fall, they had no reserves. And so the price of natural gas went from 15 to 20 up to about 80 euros per megawatt hour, went up by a factor of 5. That was before the Ukraine invasion. Then in March, we have the Ukraine invasion. And Europe imports about 30 or 40% of its gas from Russia. Russia is now cutting that off, or Europe is cutting it off. And so the price I just checked this morning was 170 euros per megawatt hour.
What?
It was 15 to 20 2 years ago. Now it's 170. It's up more than a factor of 10. So what's likely to happen is they think a quarter of people, 83% of the people in England use natural gas in their homes. They think about a quarter of those won't be able to pay their bill because the bill's going to be up by a factor of 3 at least, which means that gas companies are going to fail. They're not going to get paid for what they're doing, and the government may have to step in and nationalize those. It's even worse in industry. A union leader in Germany the other day talked about whole industries just being wiped out. The glass industry that uses ovens powered by natural gas can't make a profit. The ammonia industry that produces fertilizer can't make a profit. Petrochemical industry, they have all these industries that are seeing 10 times the price of a commodity that was about 15 or 20% of their costs, and nobody can run a business like that. So, I mean, Europe is the first taste of this idea that we can do without hydrocarbons, we can do things on wind and solar and hydrogen and biofuels, and people are going to pay the price. It really, I'm afraid to see what's going to happen in the next year.
How do we solve this?
How do we solve this?
This is
people need to get back to the stuff that really works. In the U.S., by the way, we have.
What do you know the U.S. comparable price?
Yeah, if
it's at 170 euros, what's the U.S. price right now?
Well, it's about 8 times the U.S. price. The U.S. price normally runs in a different metric at about $3 per million BTU. It went up to 9. It's down about $5.50 per million BTU. So it's up about 60% or so. And part of that is because we are.
Yeah, do you know in the state of Illinois, and I like to remind our listeners who mainly are Illinoisans, but the others do listen to this podcast. In Illinois, we are artificially capping emissions from natural gas plants. And so they're at about their limit right now for the year.
Yeah.
And so we have fully productive natural gas plants that are going to have to shut down unless Pritzker provides them some relief from regulatory, basically just blanket emissions that he put in place that are meaningless, honestly meaningless. And meanwhile, you've got people who need that natural gas.
I'll have to look into that. I was not aware of that. I know in Illinois we get 60% from nuclear right now of our electricity.
That's really the Northeast section does, because they're part of the PJM market, and Ameren does not. Their mix is more coal and natural gas. 18%
coal and 14% gas. But there are other states that are in worse trouble here. I know Michigan is closing down a nuclear plant. They're also closing some of their gas plants. They're still at about 9% renewables, but it could go much, much higher. And we have a bunch of folks. The Mid-Continent System Operator, MISO, has said we got a shortage of capacity in the Midwest, and we may have rolling blackouts this year. And a lot of that is this shift to what I call unreliables, weather-dependent energy sources. It's worse in places like California, Oklahoma, where they have a lot of wind, and they have been shutting down the other plants. But so how do we get out of this? I think people are going to learn the hard way, and I think we're going to see a break on a lot of this. It's going to take a long, long time, though, because we still have the G7 all marching out there. They want to be green. They think it's the most important thing.
But meanwhile, China and India are actually doing the opposite.
Well, China is interesting. What they do is they produce wind and solar so they can ship it to everybody else.
That's right.
But they're still getting 65 or 70% of their electricity from coal, and they're increasing they're building new coal plants. So is India, so is Indonesia, and many other places. So they're very smart in that regard.
Would we be smarter just to learn how to clean up coal? Or is coal already pretty clean?
Well, with the carbon dioxide, you really can't.
So so again, it's like essentially educating people on the threat of CO2, it's really not as big of a threat compared to...
It isn't. So again, I just said that 1/20th of what goes into the atmosphere comes from our industry, CO2. But that's still a huge amount in human terms. I'm just bringing a section of my book, and I got a picture of a coal train with about 100 cars. That's what a coal plant a big coal plant, in a single day burns all that coal, one day. And then what they do is, for every carbon atom in that coal, you take 2 oxygen atoms out of the atmosphere to produce CO2. So think of a volume of that coal train that's 2 or 3 times as big. That's how much carbon dioxide is exhausted every day from a big coal plant. Small in global terms, but it's very big in individual terms. And the idea that we can capture all that, eliminate it, and everything else is just kind of beyond common sense.
And perhaps not even necessary.
No, it isn't necessary. It's again great for plants. It's the great thing. We should be concentrating on real pollutants. We still have 80% of the world that is not treating water, discharging into lakes, rivers, and streams. That's a big, big problem. Many countries are just building their first water treatment plants. That's an area that we really ought to be putting money toward. Cleaning up of other pollution issues. Plastic in the oceans is somewhat overstated, but it still is an issue. It's more of a litter issue, if you will, than a pollution issue. But most of that, by the way, comes from Asia, and not much from the U.S. So banning your straws in Chicago is not going to have any measurable effect. But there are real problems we need to work on, and CO2 is not one of those. The good news is the world has actually been cooling for about the last 6 years, slightly, since 2016, according to satellite data at
Boy, don't tell Sean Caston.
University of Alabama, Huntsville. I'd love to debate Sean on this stuff.
I would too. I would love to see that. Maybe I'll set it up.
I'm happy to go to Wheaton. By the way, I've gone to Wheaton in the past, and
to Wheaton College?
Yeah, kind of challenged some of the speakers there that they've had in.
That's great.
And they say, well, we don't want to be political. We accept the theory of man-made warming. We don't think the Lord's in control of the climate. People now are, but we don't want to be political, and so we don't want to have a debate. But I'd love to go talk to this. I have spoken at some classes there before for professors, but it's not the accepted view.
I just may work on that.
I'd be happy to work with you.
That would be great. No, I think part of the problem here is there's a real misperception. I mean, the good news is, and I love this because. I don't know if you read Holman Jenkins. He writes in the Wall Street Journal, and in fact, he writes a lot about climate. Now, he happens to all be in for a carbon tax, which I don't see the need for that. But so I differ with him on a few things.
Yeah.
But he did write this in his Climate Sanity Lost and Found. It's an editorial from the weekend edition, June 11, 12 of this year. He says... Michael Moore and Donald Trump can both be right about something. Climate politics devolves into a corporate welfare scam.
Well, it is. It's amazing. All of this is supported by, I don't know what corporate welfare scam, but it's certainly a government sort of thing. Corporate welfare scam. I'd have to see what he meant about that. Does he mean ESG and some of the other things that are going on?
Yeah, he's talking about ESGs. He's talking about all the the EV tax credits for Tesla, things like that. I mean, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the wind and solar, the production tax credit, which is, unless you had the PTC in effect, you would never build another wind farm in the entire United States once the PTC goes fully
Huge
away.
amount of government subsidies. Matter of fact, state of Illinois right now, I think you could put in you can put in solar for free on your roof. Basically,
absolutely.
There's an Illinois credit. There's federal credits. There's all sorts of other things.
And it's shameful that they are actually going to cover really productive farmland in the midst of a potential food shortage with Chinese solar panels. That is their solution in the state of Illinois. It's just absolute nonsense. I cannot tell my audience enough about that. They need to hear that over and over again.
And it's probably likely that those panels don't break even over their lifetime. as far as energy produced. There was a study done that looked at the solar installations in Switzerland and Germany. The name escapes me who the guys were, but they estimated, they did an analysis called energy received over energy, EROI, energy received over energy invested. And they found that solar panels in Germany and Switzerland were only 0.8%. So you got less than 1% of the total energy you put into it out over a 20-year lifetime. And so what we're doing is we're paying for all this energy to be invested in China to create these solar cells. They ship it over here, and you never get as much back as what it was paid to be invested.
To build the solar panel in the first place.
Yeah, the break-even's down about North South Carolina, where you finally break even, but up north in Illinois, you don't.
Well, my favorite quote from you, and I don't know if I always give you attribution because I use it all the time, but by the way, this is from Steve Goreham. Solar in Illinois is like growing a pineapple here. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, that actually came from a guy in Germany.
Okay.
What did he say? Solar in Germany is like growing pineapples in Alaska or something like that.
Okay.
It makes about as much sense.
It makes no sense whatever.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to conclude this interview. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, and we're definitely going to have you back on. But we appreciate the update, first of all, on the Supreme Court decision that says that the EPA very much overstepped their boundaries and regulating coal out of existence. Yeah. That is not something that's within their purview to do, and it needs to be returned to the legislature. But also, I just really appreciate your insight on this topic. Always, we're going to have you back on because energy is going to continue to be a hot topic. Yeah. It doesn't matter. I don't care if we're talking about it in the next 4 months or the next 4 years. Energy is the master resource. It powers our lives. It improves our livelihoods, and it's always going to be up for discussion. So you are always going to have a voice here and, of course, everywhere else. So, again, thank you to Steve Goreham for coming on to the program, The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Steve Goreham. I know this podcast is going a little bit long, but I wanted to add in one more story that just popped up because I find it infuriating, absolutely infuriating. You know how upset we all are about property taxes, and you probably just got your bill or paid your June payment, and now, 3 months later on September 1st is going to be your second payment due to the big, your county treasurer. I mean, it is infuriating. Second highest property taxes in the nation. And so when people cheat, it really bugs you. Like Pritzker pulling out his toilets from his second mansion and taking a $330,000 property tax break that he didn't deserve. I mean, this is crazy, especially when you're a $3 billionaire. But it gets worse. I mean, it's just everybody who's kind of in that they're better than us. They don't have to play by the rules type of thing. And here comes this story from the Patch of all things. The Hinsdale Patch put this out. I just love it that the Patch put this out. It's about WGN investigative reporter Ben Bradley. He's apparently selling his Hinsdale house for $1.9 million. But the tax bill in 2020 for a $1.9 million house, $5,000. $5,000? You got to be kidding me. Oh, yeah. Yep, the Hinsdale property is owned by a land trust, which is often how famous people handle such transactions. The article goes on. Databases indicate Bradley lives in the home. In 2010, records show that the land trust bought the three-story house from a builder for $1.4 million. The Cook County assessor now values the property at $231,000. Okay, Fritz Kagi, you really fell down on this one. Before the transaction, the builder tore down the old one-story house on the property. That's probably $231,000. In Hinsdale, that land was very valuable, especially back in 2010. Built in 1915, it was about 1/7 the size of its replacement. It appears that the Cook County Assessor's Office never took into account that a far more expensive house was built in the old house's place. When questions were raised, we immediately reached out to the assessor's office and have heard nothing back. If and when they get back to me, I will, of course, pay the amount due, as I have always done in the past, Bradley said in an email to the Patch. Well, he's got like about 12 years of back payments to make. All right, let's go on. The article goes on. He said Patch raised the questions and that he had paid every amount he was billed. If the assessor wants to claim I owe something different and that's proven true, of course I'm going to pay, Bradley said. Blah, 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 blah. If the house is actually worth $1.9 million, the property taxes would amount to $40,000 a year. At $1.5 million, the taxes would be $32,000. Now, I mean, come on. If you live in a house, I mean, it's pretty common to know what other people are paying for property taxes, or to have a conversation with your neighbor or your friend who lives in the same community about it. And basically you're bitching and moaning and complaining because they're so damn high in the state of Illinois. In fact, it's a big reason why people are leaving the state is because high property taxes. So let's look at this a little bit further. I mean, like, does anybody believe that this guy didn't know that he should be paying more than $5,000 on a $1.9 million home? Does anybody believe Ben Bradley? Anybody? No. You'd be foolish if you did. Okay, so here it goes on. This doesn't mean government bodies lost any money. It just means that other taxpayers picked up the slack. That's right, because the government always gets what they want. It's just others pay for it. The loser in this situation is the neighbor, Patrick Hines, Lyons Township assessor, said in an interview. Just look at the houses on either side of the property. One house is worth $950,000 with a property tax bill of $19,000. The other is valued at $396,000 with a tax bill of $8,200. Hines, who was elected assessor last year, said it is not unusual for the county assessor to miss a major change in property. In recent years, the county office, where Hines worked for 24 years, has become severely understaffed. Oh, please. Ridiculous. I just wanted to bring you that story because you know what? Everybody's at fault here. The assessor's at fault. I'm not buying Hines' story either. You miss a $1.9 million property. Oh, no, that is not true. By the way, the school district's at fault too. The school district actually looks for stuff like this. They also have their eyes out for they're always looking for new development. They're always looking to make sure that they're getting every bit of property on the tax rolls. I blame everybody involved in this entire scam. He was given a pass. And then Ben Bradley's the worst of them. You really think you only own $5,000 in property taxes? Give me a break. Nobody believes you. Nobody believes you. You should have to pay all that back with interest to the property taxpayers. It's ridiculous. All right, that's my rant for the day. Lots going on in the state of Illinois. A lot of big decisions that are going to be made by voters coming up. So stay tuned here so you can be an informed voter when it comes to November. Thank you for joining me on The Real Story with Jeanne Ives.